if this morning, when this morning you said I was going to talk about the war in Libya, let's be honest, I would have preferred that, the war in Libya and operations, to the thing I'm doing now, but there's nothing very innovative in a war, so let's talk innovation and let's talk other things. Just to remind you, in Libya we had 4 F-16s, sometimes even 6. Sometimes even 6. But let me just remind you, when you see all those figures we have seen here, you don't see Belgium in it, but the Belgian Air Force, and you Israelis know it better than we do, being a small country too, the Belgian Air Force Belgium is smaller than New York. But Belgium participated for 78 days in the Kosovo War. Belgium participated in the Libya War. Belgium is since, the Air Force every time, is since 4 years in Afghanistan. New York can't do that. So we are a lot better than they are. Well, we can do that too, but I suppose you will before us there. There's no problem. Let me, first of all, say that what I'm going to tell here is purely personal and my personal view only. During my period of Air Chief, I had 6 ministers of defense, and I had a fight with all 6 of those ministers, so what I'm telling here is my personal view, and it's not the official view, nor of Belgium, nor of NATO, and that's what I'm going to try to tell you. The approach of the problem of innovation and the actions between the defense requirements and the industry and the research and technology is different. The approach is different for a bigger nation than it is for a smaller nation, of course. And a smaller nation in Europe and in NATO, it's even more different because there you are depending on other nations and you have to go in a certain way. Besides the influence of the technology on defense matters, there is, of course, and you know that too, but it's even worse for us in Europe, there is the national interests and there are the industrial lobbying and the industrial interests. When we have seen those graphs a few hours ago about Europe and the United States and Israel, something shocked me there, and even it was really not really right. You are comparing apples and pears. The United States, and the word says it, are states that are united. Israel is one state. Europe is a union of nations, of different nations, and a union, as you know, is a thing where they talk a lot and they act very little. So it's completely different. As a state and as a national interest in all those interesting things in NATO, it is, of course, completely different. Military tasks and requirements in democracy are focused on peacekeeping. That's what NATO is doing for the moment. So we do, most of the time, what we do is peacekeeping, sometimes peace restoring. That was what NATO called the action in Kosovo was peace restoring, the action in Libya was peace restoring, the actions in Kosovo now and the actions in some countries are peacekeeping, but very seldom we go beyond that. The actions of those countries and the military actions are steered, controlled, and certainly limited by politicians. And politicians, especially in our countries, are not necessarily experts. One of the ministers, of the 6 ministers I had, even never served in the military, but he was Minister of Defense, and you have to discuss with those people. It's not always a gift. When I say the influence of technology on military requirements and vice versa, which was the title of this conference, technology should never be a driver for military requirements. If technology is a driver for military requirements, you push people in things where they don't want to go. Technology can be a driver for military capabilities, which is completely different from the requirements, of course. And there I would like to quote, and here I have to put on my glasses because I'm becoming a little bit older than a few years ago, the time that I could read those little letters from Theodore von Karman, Dr. von Karman, which was one of the great guys in NATO, in the beginning of NATO, said, "Scientific results cannot be used efficiently by soldiers who have not understanding of them. And scientists cannot produce results useful for warfare without an understanding of the operations." And that's what I meant by saying technology should never be a driver for the requirements. The military requirements as a driver for technology is not a very good thing either, because the military have this bad habit to be not always very realistic in their dreams and in what they want. The military requirement being a driver for the technology is most of the time very expensive. They ask things which are very difficult to realize, and sometimes with a little bit less you can have exactly the same result. And that's what I meant by the third point. It's not always cost effective for most of the requirements. And I will give a few examples later on. The military requirements and the technological development should be a result of a dialogue between industry, a dialogue between the technocrats and between the military. It should be a continuous interaction. There should be, we do this, you do it that way, okay, it's better, no, it should be a continuous interaction and a dialogue. The military requirements have more chance to be a success if there is a possible spin-off for civilian use. And we have seen in many of the modern realizations in industry for the military, later on you have a spin-off for the civil applications and possibilities. And the military should sometimes look more at off-the-shelf possibilities and with small adaptations have what they want. And I gave a few examples where I said that the military requirement being a driver for technology is not always a good thing. You know, the use of PC tablets and checklists in operations, that's a very good thing, and it's more and more used. But we saw this morning, in the beginning of the conference, how long it can take before you have your tablet started up or your program going on. And if you are in the middle of the combat and suddenly your batteries give up, then you have a problem. A paper flip-over checklist takes about the same place, is about the same weight as this PC or this tablet checklist, but in operations and in desert sand and in humid environment and things like that, it's a lot better and it's a lot easier to use. I give another example. The United States and NASA had a lot of money going on in research to have a ball pen that could write in zero gravity. A ball pen, normally the gravity holds your ink down and make it write. In zero gravity, it was a problem. And they spent a lot of money for NASA to have something to be able to write, a kind of a ball pen in zero gravity. The Russians use a pencil. And it's exactly the same result. So this is technology where it is not really required and where the requirement exceeds and is too expensive. When I said that national interests and industrial lobbying can sometimes kill innovative actions, well, I give you a few examples. In Europe, we have so many different nations with different armed forces and different air forces, and every air force is engaging pilots, taking pilots as coming out of the school. They give them a training, and then they make a pilot. And this pilot is integrated in NATO. And all NATO pilots use the same procedures. The schools where the guys are coming from have approximately the same level. But in between the school and between the final pilot, everybody has his own way of forming his pilot, have his own type of aircraft to finally arrive at the same thing. In 1995, we in Belgium, we said, and we proposed in NATO, let's do it different. Let's look at the automotive industry, where in Europe you have a Volvo, which is working in Spain, in Norway, in so many different places, and all the cars coming out of Volvo are the same cars. They are made with the same tools, and they have the same capacity. Why should we make pilots in different ways? Let us make all together pilots in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Norway, wherever we have some place or some room or some capacity to do it, and have the same program of making pilots. And that was what we called the Euro training. But we went a little bit further. We Europeans are masters in reinventing the war model. When the Americans invent something, we start studying and we invent it again. And it's most of the time, it's about the same capacity, but it's 5, 6, 10 years later. And in aircraft industry, the Americans are far ahead of Europe in making aircraft, except, and that was what the point was there, except in training aircraft. The Americans use training aircraft from all over the place. They don't make their own training aircraft. But in Europe, we are so good that the French had a training aircraft, the British have a training aircraft, the Italians have one, the Spanish people have one, the Czechs have one, all different aircraft. Every aircraft that you make costs you a lot of non-recurring costs, which drives the price high and makes the number of aircraft you can build smaller because every one of those countries. So the idea there was, let's make, like in the automotive industry, the same pilots with the same tool, and let us invent the new generation training aircraft. And we started that, and it took some time. Happily, we have, in Europe, we have the European Air Chiefs Conference, EURAC, where the air chiefs meet without any political agenda, just as friends, and they discuss those things. And it took us, Belgium, about 2 years to convince everybody that this Euro training, Euro trainer, the ET2, like we said, or ET square, was a good idea. And okay, it seemed to be a good idea, and we finally got 12 nations which were involved. And we did a pre-feasibility study, which worked very well, and industry paid that. So that was already a good thing. And then we did the feasibility study, and the feasibility study, we still were 10 of us. There were 2 already that dropped because there, the feasibility study had to be paid by the Air Forces itself. And the feasibility study came out very, very well. And then the chair of this group, of this Euro trainer group, changed, and another country took over from Belgium, and that other country had somewhere in his drawers already a kind of training aircraft, not of the generation we were looking at, but a training aircraft that had to be sold. And the ET square action is completely dead nowadays. It was a missed chance, I think, there for Europe. We had something similar when the aircraft came out fly-by-wire. We proposed to industry, instead of just copying it, go fly-by-fiber-wire. Try to develop that. It is still not done. So maybe there's somebody in the audience which has an idea, let's do that, go fly-by-fiber-wire for the aircraft, he can develop it. Europe has, after the F-16 came out, Europe built the Rafale, the Eurofighter, nowadays again the Gripen. You see that is every time it is a national interest which is not a very good thing for innovation, which is not a very good thing for having a good, and so many others. You can fill in this blank yourself, probably. The influence of technology on military requirements and vice versa, there is a difference between the bigger and the smaller nations. I told that already. The needs are high for a big nation. A nation like the United States, a nation like Russia, like China, the needs are completely different from those like a country like Belgium. Just happily for us, our needs are divided amongst the other partners in NATO. External policy, which is a driver for defense and for the development in defense. External policy is completely different, of course. The external policy from the United States, again, compared even to the external policy, if there is any, from Europe, and I have my doubts about that, is completely different. The means, you have to look at the budgets. The means and the budgets are completely different. The ambitions are limited for the smaller countries. For some big countries, they are. The autonomy for a big country wants to remain autonomous. We smaller countries know that we can't remain autonomous, and so we depend on each other. But that creates a problem. And for a smaller country, the cooperation is a must, an absolute must in defense technology. It is not a must for countries like China or like the United States. What are the drivers? The drivers today are the globalization. Everything is global now, everything in the world, and science and technology included, so that is one of the drivers for the technology in the military. Another point, which is very important, is the blurring between the boundaries between defense and security. There is due to the, I would say, unorthodox way of war fighting nowadays, it's hard to say sometimes whether you are in defense or whether you are in security problems. The fact that this difference is blurring more and more makes that the means that you use, as well for defense as for security, are more or less the same too. And in many countries, this is not understood yet. Many countries, they still make the difference between homeland security, between security, and between the military. That creates a problem that some of the means that are used are not well used. And sometimes you could, by just regrouping the means for security and the means for defense, by regrouping them, you should be able to do with less to do more. The increasing speed and complexity is, of course, one of the drivers for the technology in military business. It goes always faster, and we have seen it today in this conference already. Things are stepping up and always going faster. Technology, military technology has to follow that, and if you follow that, it creates, of course, very big problems in budgets. So regrouping in NATO, and I will talk, if I have some time left, about that later on, but regrouping that in NATO and doing some research and technology work all together is a good thing. By the way, NATO is not only doing that for NATO, but NATO is open to many other countries, and some programs in NATO, Israel is, for instance, involved in some research and technology programs in NATO. The constrained resources, of course, I should not talk about that more than that. More and more, and especially in Western Europe, the defense budget are cut down, so it creates a problem to be innovative in technology there, in military technology. And the evolved role of industry, I already talked about that, and the converging technologies make that all those things are more and more complicated. There are interdependent effects. Nationally, you have, of course, the countries that still hold on their sovereignty. You have health problems, you have the critical infrastructure, the environment, the ideology, and you have the institutions. The threats, on the other hand, compared to that, are the interstate conflicts, they are terrorism, the radicalization, crime, natural disasters and accidents. And threat multipliers outside of those two can be the climate change, can be energy security, which is a big problem, of course, can be strategic resources, when we will talk about that probably too, can be the security for the countries. The financial crisis is certainly a problem for this, for the perspective for military technology. The globalization of technology is a problem too. The opportunities and threats, what is positive is of course that the societies get more and more connected. What is positive is that we have e-commerce, that we have improved health outcomes all over the Western world, that we have a renewal of energy possibilities now, and that we have clean technologies. On the other side, the bad things are the radicalization compared to the connected society, the identity theft, which comes out of the e-commerce and of the capabilities, the technological capabilities there, the bioterrorism, compared to the improved health outcomes. After research for the one, you can use it for the others, and the environmental degradation. The need for cooperation between the smaller nations and at one side, and more for the bigger nations because they feel the problem too, is led to the RTO Research and Technology Organization, NATO's premier forum for R&D cooperation among the member nations, achieving by this the dual objective of making NATO more effective and more affordable at the same time. At the same time, the RTO helps to build coherence and synergy among the nations and the investments. The RTO promotes and conducts cooperative research, and that's in NATO, and information exchange, develops and maintains a long-term NATO research and technology strategy, and provides guidance and advice to all elements of NATO and the nations on R&D issue. They gave me a sign. I still have a lot of that to say, but let's try to do it as fast and as quick as possible. The RTO finally has a legacy of cooperative defense, research and technology, and that goes back to Dr. von Karman, which I already told, and which said that we should all work together. And he started that in the Group for Aerospace Research and Development, the AGARD, well known, and AGARD had a counterpart for the Army, the Defense Research Group, and in 1998 those two groups melted together and made the RTO, which is actually still existing and working very well. NATO had a holistic approach to meet those needs, and the portfolio of this approach is the interoperability and the standardization. That is a very important thing, of course. If you have so many nations in NATO with all different standards, all different operational possibilities, and you try to work together, then you have to be interoperable and standardized. They go for innovative solutions, and that's what they try to do. They go for transition technologies to go from one to the other. They have studies, and all those is done in some panels, in working groups. They go for a study of the disruptive technologies which might give at some time an advantage, an edge for the counterparts, for the opponent, for the enemy, let's call. So it's very important to identify those disruptive technologies in advance to be able to be in front of everything. They go for knowledge, operational analysis and advice. They have a group which works for military force generation, capability development, confidence building and threat mitigation. I'll just read, because the time is up. I'll just read. Well, you can read those two when you have because it's still. I've took all those different groups and subgroups in panels. For instance, here, smart textiles for NATO warfight, textiles with solar energy, textiles with biological warfare agents in it, and so on. That's what those groups study. High power microwave and directed energy weapons. They do on risk-based planning. All this is generation, modeling for urban terrain to be able to prepare operations in urban terrain. Not lethal weapon capabilities, psychological warfare, cyber defense, which will be the future, and security in. So that is about it. Those are the different groups, but you will have them if you go on the website. Sorry to be so long. I thought I was speaking faster or that the time was evolving slower. Thank you for your attention. I would like to thank especially for the last part of the speech, the chief scientists of NATO, which is the head of the Research and Technology Agency, and it is Husniot, Major General Husniot, which is a friend of mine and an old colleague. Okay, thank you.